In today's increasingly challenging gaming landscape, you need every advantage that you can get. What if just having a great game with high LTV just isn't good enough? What if a competitor at larger scale with a portfolio of games rather than just a single game was able to drive a higher portfolio LTV relative to your game with only a single game LTV? Further, what does a modern day technical growth stack look like in a post IDFA and post fingerprinting world? Today, we learn from the lessons of Mexico's largest games publisher, Hyperbeard, along with two of Hyperbeard's partners, Tenjin, their MMP or mobile measurement provider, and Sonamine, a game data analytics and monetization consulting firm. Both companies have worked to help Hyperbeard achieve success, and they share their secrets with you today. So coming up, an introduction to Hyperbeard, its partners, as well as discussion on the concept of Portfolio LTV and what a modern day growth stack looks like. Stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm excited to have a number of guests today to speak about two things, really. At the high level, we want to talk about this concept of Portfolio LTV. And secondly, we want to talk about what does a modern day growth stack look like. And with us to talk about this, we have Alex Kozachenko, who is the CEO of Hyperbeard, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but it is Mexico's largest games publisher and developer.
Correct.
And you guys have a ton of, was it over 100 million users or something crazy?
Yeah, 250 million downloads over the last 5 years.
Nice. And also joining us, we have Chris Farm, who's the CEO of Tenjin, an MMP provider that has also worked very closely with Hyperbeard, and also Nick Lim, the president of Sonamine, who also works on, is it monetization solutions, Nick? And we'll kind of dive into it later if you can provide more context about what you guys are doing. But how would you describe yourselves at a high level?
Yeah, at a high level, we are sort of a data agency for games and publishers. We just are very good at using data to help improve things at games.
Great. And so for our audience, we are, I think in the current environment, it's so difficult to achieve success in mobile. And yet we've got Alex here with Hyperbeard, and there were a number of case studies that both you developed with Chris and with Nick separately in terms of some of the things that you guys have been doing. And I thought we could go into that. But Alex, maybe we could start by having you speak a little bit more about Hyperbeard, what you guys are doing. And then from there, it'd be great to kind of understand the relationship that you have with Chris and Nick.
Sure, absolutely. So Hyperbeard is what you would consider a boutique publisher. This is kind of a term that was thrown around a bunch maybe 5 or 6 years ago, kind of publishers that really specialize in a very select particular type of game. You could argue even like Zynga was one of these publishers. They obviously had all the matching games, and eventually they kind of branched out into other titles. So what we have kind of stuck with is this audience, which is females 18 to 30, kind of young adult female, who like a particular set of games. And the kind of the unifying word we have for our portfolio is cute. So we like to think of our portfolio as this cute bubble. Basically, what we try to do is get users in, whether it's through some of our legacy games or some of our newer games, figure out any way to get them in and then have them kind of move around the portfolio. And in order for that to work, the games, they can vary a bit from genre to genre. They can even vary a bit from audience, but there has to be enough overlap where enough users are moving from one title to another. Because obviously one of the main challenges right now is getting new users and getting them at a price you can afford. And for us, being casual and having relatively low LTVs, especially with our audience, we really need to measure LTV across the portfolio for UA to make sense.
Right. And Alex, just for our audience, so they understand your business better, could you talk to us about how does your portfolio currently kind of look like now in terms of the number of games that you guys have, as well as how many new games are you introducing on a regular, are new games coming in at a regular cadence, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we probably have around 20, maybe possibly 25 games that are live on the store. 10, 15 of them are really not operated anymore. They just kind of exist, but they still get downloads. The thing about Google and Apple, both stores, is they're very historically, algorithmically driven. Once you get traffic, you continue to get traffic. And so the 10 that are operated, we are both operating internally, and we're also operating with our publishing partners, so our developers that have built the games. And some we even take on or we acquire from our developing partners at some point. But yeah, that's kind of how it works. And then in terms of the new games, we try to release around 4 a year. Last year we did 2. This year we're on track to do around 6. That's kind of the sweet spot we found for kind of just the overall kind of organic uplift. Too much and you're cannibalizing yourself, too few and you're not taking advantage of enough organic opportunities. And we just try to kind of, in a way, not in comparison to Netflix, but we realize that at some point people are going to get tired of one game and they're going to want to find another game. So we want to make sure we're providing something for them.
Great. And as far as the relationship that you have with Chris and Nick, could you kind of describe that at a high level? And then maybe I could kick it over to those guys to go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked with Nick at Sonamine for a long time, and his team. We are, we were laughing earlier when someone said I was sophisticated in the way I think about things. I like to think of ourselves as pretty data dumb. We like to, obviously, we collect the data that we can, which is limited for obviously a number of reasons, a bunch of privacy reasons and whatnot. But it's really not my background, not my expertise, nor is it anyone on my team. So they can really help us to interpret the data that we have and find opportunities for growth, for monetization. Obviously, it's all tied to growth, right? You need to monetize better in order to grow. And so Nick has helped us over the years to do that, largely centering around kind of UA as a principle, right? Because you need that calculation to make sense. And then where Tenjin comes into play is Tenjin is our MMP, and they are the ones that have allowed us to kind of put all the pieces together, both through the product that they offer and also through their custom dev services. And that's kind of where Portfolio LTV came in for us. It's kind of been a vision, honestly, for the last 2 or 3 years. It just was never the right time internally to kind of set that project until we kind of had the right partners to help us get there.
Right. And maybe like starting with you, Chris, could you explain to the audience what does an MMP do? And then there was like some concern that with IDFA deprecation that the role of the MMP would change, but can you speak to whether that has changed at all, or is it basically the same?
Yeah, sure. The role of an MMP historically was to figure out like which sources of traffic that you are advertising on produce the highest return on investment. And I think that's still the case, but it has changed a lot from like IDFA deprecation and moving to a world where things are less transparent. And so one of the things that we kind of differentiate on is that we try to pull all this data together in like a single place. And that hasn't really changed. Like we provide like these data warehouses as a service so that companies don't have to like build their own data warehouses as well. This is one of the ways that we're kind of different from a lot of the other MMPs. And as a result, even with kind of the deprecation of IDFA, like our belief still remains that you can pull all the different types of data that you can get. And it's even more necessary, arguably even more necessary that you do that and have partners that can analyze and look at that data appropriately.
Right. In terms of like your relationship with Alex and Hyperbeard, so part of what I read in terms of the case study was it seemed largely oriented around this notion of portfolio LTV, but was that, Alex, when you guys were evaluating Tenjin, was that like one of the primary use cases that you were thinking about, or was that just also a nice to have? Or maybe you could speak to, maybe Chris, you could speak to what is meant by portfolio LTV, and then Alex, I'd love to hear kind of what went into your decision about choosing Tenjin versus other MMPs, and like what are the sort of metrics or bases of competition that you think about when you think about MMPs?
Yeah, sure. So the notion of portfolio LTV, I don't think it was something that we were looking to do from the very beginning. It was just sort of this natural thing to look at once we understood kind of what the customers wanted to do, or in this case, Alex wanted to do with the data. So at a high level, what we think of as portfolio LTV is if you have, more than 1 or 2 apps, you have the ability to, you have some control over the way that your users can experience your game. And when they get tired or they feel like they're going to churn from the game, you can try to incentivize or motivate them to stay within the rest of your ecosystem of apps. And, we started to see through the data that it was very natural for customers to want to feel like and play similar games in your portfolio of games. And so it kind of naturally generated from that as an idea. At least that's what we kind of thought of. And that germinated into a lot of different analyses that we tried to do and kind of optimize that experience for the customer. And I think it's still very, very early stages of the industry where people think sophisticated in a sophisticated way about this. There's a lot of things and opportunities that I can personally see that, if you can create like a branding around your portfolio, you have like a very good shot of doing something like this. And there's a lot of product ideas that can spawn from that. And I don't think people have even tried them yet, but having like a universal currency across different apps, or like very similar experiences, or sharing different types of virtual goods across apps, like that becomes a lot more possible when optimization and metrics are there.
Right. And Chris, maybe what I could do is just for our audience, just to kind of explain a little bit more of what you mean by portfolio LTV is, and maybe I could try to explain it in a little bit simpler way for our audience, which is to say that today, and we're talking about growth right now and talking about, how do you acquire users for not only your game, but in this case, what we're talking about is if you have multiple games and you can cross promote from one game to another, then essentially when you acquire a user, you may be acquiring a user not only for the single game that you're advertising for, but because there is a form of cross promotion, that player that may then go to another game actually has a higher value than you would have normally anticipated just from advertising for a player to a single game. And maybe a good example of the historical examples of this we saw in hyper casual, where a lot of hyper casual games had low ARD, average retention days. And so as you were pumping players into one hyper casual game, you'd already be cross promoting them to the next game. And a lot of the hyper casual publishers then look to build a large portfolio of hyper casual games that were releasing at regular cadences so that they can move players between those games. And the Japanese also had this notion of like their old gacha games of taking a lot of players to one gacha game and then at a certain point in time start shifting them to other gacha games. And so you would think about, to your point, portfolio value. And so it does seem like in this current extremely competitive marketplace that these kinds of notions and the ability to think beyond just what everybody else is doing would potentially give you strategic advantage. But would you say that I've characterized that correctly, Chris?
Yeah, from like a mathematical perspective, you can effectively increase your overall return on investment, right? Like you can acquire a user in one app and essentially it becomes just this mathematical game of, if you acquire a user for, let's say, $1 in your first app, you can basically cross promote them into another one of your portfolio apps at a much cheaper price. I mean, there's an opportunity cost there in the sense that you could have shown another ad, right, of another publisher. But it's a much lower opportunity cost, and you can build your LTV this way. And it's actually one of the ways that the math of hyper casual publishers existed. I mean, they would be acquiring users for much more than they could make in any single app, but like taken as a whole, like it was generating profit for them. So that's kind of how they thought about that.
Right. And to some degree, what we're seeing in a lot of the Forex games now, where they basically have now created one more like kind of a casual game and then turn into like a Forex game like Whiteout Survival or Last War, for example. That's kind of a little bit of taking this notion and just kind of integrating into a single game, right?
Okay. Yeah. And I think it's actually exacerbating the profit you can make, even with the rise of things like hybrid casual.
Yeah.
The profit is the margin's actually getting thicker, because if you can do and implement this strategy, you might be able to acquire a user in a hyper casual game and cross promote them into something that, has in-app purchases or subscriptions or things like that. And the margin can actually be wider in some cases.
Alex, have you thought about doing something like that, given that you have this broad understanding of your audience and you have a number of games that are casual in nature and that have potentially very high conversion rates in IPM, for example, that you would then do kind of like a whiteout survival type of strategy where you bring in players to one game and then the game kind of transforms into a higher monetizing game? Have you ever thought about doing something like that?
Yes. However, building a whiteout survival is more the challenge. So, both because it's not necessarily a good fit for our audience, but also just the product expertise needed.
Sure.
Like I said, we're not an especially data savvy company. So, our LTVs may differ 2x between games, but they don't differ 50x, which is kind of how you'd probably compare the LTV of some of our games to like a game like Whiteout Survival. So we do have the feeder principle, which is basically that certain games will have substantially lower CPIs, but also extremely low LTVs. And those are really just games we want to run UA into or drive users into to get them into the portfolio to then go somewhere else.
Right.
That's still something we're really trying to explore, and we're even opening up the exploration to our legacy titles, since we have a ton of downloads on those historically. But we know that the LTVs just can't sustain UA on a one-to-one basis. So the nice thing about portfolio analyzing this at the portfolio level is it really does open up the opportunities. You don't need to just have a single game. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Obviously, there's a lot of advantages as well in terms of product expertise and aligning marketing and everything. But we're not reliant on any one game being successful. We have a bunch that we can go push people into.
Right. And before we kick it over to Nick, Alex, could you also just comment on that other part of the question that I asked? So when you were looking at Tenjin as an MMP relative to some of the other MMPs in market, how did you make that decision? And again, was this portfolio LTV feature a key part of that, or that was just like a nice to have?
Yeah, so I don't know that we had the discussions about portfolio. So we were thinking about it before, but it was something that was still a step away. One of the things that Tenjin did offer was custom dev services along with the contract that we had, and that would allow us to kind of build the BI. And so we knew that was the case, and that was ultimately the vision that I had for that, although I don't know that I expressed that to them at the time. And that's eventually what they did. And obviously Nick and his team at Sonamine also helped us to build that, because again, it's not really our expertise. The other thing that Tenjin allowed us to do was to kind of expand our UA pool. The thing about having low LTVs is you really want low overhead on top of your costs. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, most MMPs are charging you on a per install basis, tracked back to a UA source or any sort of tracking source. So some of the bigger MMPs out there are not especially cheap. If you want to expand outside of tier 1, good luck. And it depends on obviously the scale. If you have massive scale, you can negotiate a deal, but we can't pay 2 cents on an install in India where the LTV is 1.5 cents,
right.
For example. Right. It makes absolutely no sense. So this has allowed us to kind of open up the pool. And right now we're actually seeing a ton of success with our global campaigns that we're running, which we wouldn't even think about running on an MMP if the cost structure just didn't make sense.
Right. Okay, so Nick, coming over to you, and I know you wrote, or I don't know if it was you or somebody at Sonamine had written a case study about working with Hyperbeard. Could you kind of dive into that, and maybe also talk about some of the services that you provide? Because what I read is you provide end-to-end solution packages, but what does that specifically mean?
Well, thanks. Let me just touch upon working with Alex. So he's right. We've actually worked together a long time. And prior to Tenjin, actually, we were working with the provider with some ideas around there too. And the data wasn't as well put together, which is why it was really actually great to work with Tenjin's data warehouse. And once all the data was sort of put in one place, it's fairly easy for us to help Alex sort of answer some of the basic questions like, how do users move between the games? Like, did they come in here? Did they go into this other game? So we did a lot of that initial exploration to help them out a little bit. And I think we discovered a lot of opportunities that allow Alex and his team to sort of strategize and prioritize where they would be putting some of their UA efforts. One of the reasons that we call it in, I think, is because, when you look at the traditional MMPs, when you run a campaign, you get the cost, and then you also get the revenues associated with that campaign. But they tend to be tied to just that one game. So there's no real easy way to actually see the portfolio LTV for that campaign. And so I think that's where we will be able to help Alex and his team figure out a different way to do it and to see it so that they can use it every day to figure out the revenues for each campaign that are portfolio-wide.
So Nick, could you maybe dive into that a little bit more in terms of like what specifically? So it sounded like you're helping Hyperbeard with some data analysis of some kind. I guess you're doing that even with IDFA deprecation, lack of user level tracking. So it'd be interesting to understand what you're specifically looking at, and then are you helping more on a UA basis or more from just trying to understand exactly what you guys are doing together?
Yeah, Alex, do you want to take the analysis question, and then I can do the what else we have question?
Yeah, so he kind of helped us take, obviously, Tenjin was the tool that we used to, and Growth Stack was the tool that we used to bring the data in, but obviously we need to clean it up and make it serviceable, which means creating the right dashboards, the right reports. One of the things that they did also was just a custom analysis to say, hey, do you have this percent of users moving between 2 games, this percent between 3, this percent between 4. Here is your largest feeder game, the one that users are coming into. This is the one they go to most likely, and then here's the next one, here's the next one. And some of the things that we can do with that, for example, is we can structure our cross promos such that we show ads in those proportions based on where users are likely to go and also where they're likely to monetize, right? Because the whole idea of the whiteout survival question is, you want users to go where they're going to give you the highest LTV, but obviously you need a high probability that they're going to go there. Otherwise, you're just showing an ad for the sake of showing an ad. So those are some of the use cases that they've helped us with. And like I said, it's because we don't really have any data analysis in-house. That's been very helpful to have their help.
Okay.
Yeah. And in terms of, we think of it as data is sort of a journey. So when you start out and you have a game and you're, UAing, that's where you start because you got to bring some users in. So we help on that front. If the data is present, we can generate scan prediction models, for example. That's something that we have looked into with Alex as well, where even though there's IDFA deprecation, we can still, with the conversion values that are coming in, predict to within 5% of accuracy what the LTV would be like based on the conversion values that are coming back for that particular scan campaign. But sometimes what happens is we realize that the scan conversion value schemas are actually restricting what you can predict. So we will go back and help developers figure out, hey, actually, you should use a bigger and broader scan schema that can capture more conversion values, not just revenue. That's the go-to for most developers today, is just to put revenue buckets in their scan values. We actually recommend that you don't do that just because you've lost a lot of data already. So we will help design the scan schema to get you better predictions at the scan level, if that's something you want to do. That's on the US side. Sonamine also helps on the monetization and the retention side. So the minute a user starts playing your game, that's only half of the challenge. Now, how do you keep them and make them spend money when they feel like they're getting value from it? So we run AI predictions on top of the data that you have, and we identify segments of users that are about to leave or to convert, and we help you nudge them along if they're going to convert. And if they're going to leave, we help provide some rewards that you think might help to keep them.
Okay. So if I were to kind of summarize the stuff that you guys have worked on together and potentially other services. So in terms of the data infrastructure stack, did you guys put that together? Did you guys implement that for Alex? Is that one thing that you guys did?
So actually, Tenjin has a data warehousing product. So they
Okay.
grouped all the data together, but we had to go in and do some cleaning. So quite frequently, as an example, every app might have a different user ID or different device IDs, or the device IDs might change over time. So we need to kind of match them up. So we did a lot of the work to help match up IDs so that you could match up an ID in the first game to the second game. They're actually the same player. Right? So we did a lot of the work there. So we cleaned up the data, and then Alex shot us a bunch of questions, and then we answered a bunch of questions through analysis, and then we showed them in reports so that his UA team can actually run them every day and basically make buying decisions based on the LTV, portfolio LTV of each campaign.
Got it. So Chris, so at Tenjin, do you guys store all the analytics events? So all the telemetry stuff is going into Tenjin data warehouse? Is that how it's working?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, we store all the analytics events, we do all the attribution events, all the scan stuff, and even to the extent that you have like external services that you want to like pull data from that are like separated, we can get those as well. So I think we're trying to just, again, like we're a little bit differentiated in this way that if a lot of big companies will build this themselves. Like you
Right.
go to like a Zynga, they'll have like 5 to 10 engineers that just do that.
Mhm.
Then on top of that, those 5 to 10 engineers will kind of take the next step and do what Nick is doing. Like they'll clean the data and like make it usable, right? So the way that we kind of play a role in this sort of setup is we pull all the data together, and then at this point, like Nick and Sonamine will take that and then clean it up and make it very usable and actionable.
Right. And then Nick, it sounded like the other stuff that you guys were doing is like some PLTV analysis as well as churn analysis. And then you are also managing Hyperbeard CRM in terms of like notifications, messages, things like that, or working together in some way to manage that?
I'll throw that to Alex since he's on the
So we're relative. So we've always kind of had like one hand in the new game cookie jar and then one hand out, whereas everyone else has shifted kind of 75, 80%, 90% towards live ops. We're starting to shift that way too, but I would say up to this point, we've basically been 50-50. So that means our live ops teams are very lean and basically just focused almost entirely on content and new features.
Nice.
So we haven't really had an internal CRM tool or a team or a person. So we've kind of pushed those initiatives off, but it is something that's on our roadmap as we kind of make that shift towards more live ops focused.
Yeah, since we do a lot of that, we've at least provided with Alex with some recommendations on at least some changes that need to be made in the current implementation to sort of make that easier and make it so that it will scale. Because you've got 4 game launches, 6 game launches a year. The last thing you want to do is to repeat something that takes a long time. So it's got to be hyper efficient.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so like Alex, so you've got a game and let's say that the LTV for a certain game is like, I don't know, $2. But then there's also like a portfolio value or like maybe Nick, could you explain what you guys do, or Alex, either of you guys explain how do you get from like the game specific LTV, and then how does the portfolio LTV then override that specific game LTV? How do you guys think about that? What kind of analysis kind of goes through your head?
Sure. So one of the reports we have right now is, I think it's the portfolio multiplier. So basically, it just says it takes your total measured app LTV revenue, and then your portfolio, which is taking all the users that were acquired in that one app and then measuring their value across the portfolio. And in some games, it's plus 20%. Some games, it's plus 50. Some games, it's plus 100. Usually the ones that are the higher ones tend to be the kind of the smaller ones because they feed kind of some of the bigger games, and the bigger games can be smaller because those are also the ones that tend to acquire most users for. But that's just kind of one example of how we're looking at it. If we can go drive those percentages higher, then if it's, for example, plus 25% on Pocket Love, we can hit 75% ROAS, and that's still a positive thing for us, right? Whereas otherwise we'd have to hit 100% or obviously additional with margin. One of the things that we've really struggled with historically is measuring organic uplift. We could not assign any sort of organic uplift value to UA because we were so organic, and we'd hit these organic spikes all the time where we'd start a campaign, it would go up a little bit, then we'd just tank, and then we'd go spike way back up. And it's all based on the organics, has nothing to do with UA itself. So as we kind of get our spend higher, we can actually see the effect of UA on the organics as well, which has been kind of something that's really important for us. We know it exists. It's just been immeasurable up to this point.
Okay.
And something interesting about the multiplier is that the multipliers change. They're never static. So, when Alice's team changes the cross promo sort of percentages or algorithm, then the multiplier changes as a result as well.
Right.
And they can tweak it because now they can see, the downstream game that they're promoting to, the LTV has changed in some way. And so they can tweak the cross promo to go to different games. And then that affects the multiplier, which then goes back into UA.
Right. So you've got a game that's feeding other games that then kind of add to the LTV of that game. And so then you can kind of come up with a higher value basically for that specific game.
Correct.
Just to simplify.
So the Pocket Love example is a good one. It's, again, if you have plus 25%, then you can lose that margin on ROAS for a particular campaign, and you still know that campaign is still a positive or net break even, which usually for UA is an okay thing.
Okay. And sounds like you've used this strategy to great success in Mexico. But maybe I could also just ask you a broad-based question. Since IDFA, the way that you have been doing user acquisition, like how has it changed, if at all? And what is the current, like how are you successful in the current UA market today?
Sure. So most of the portfolio LTV stuff has been Android centric, just because it is easier to track. It is easier to get more granular in terms of the measurements. And when IDFA was deprecated, or they started asking for permission for it, it really didn't affect us, to be honest. We've been a very brand focused, brand centric developer, publisher, and that actually is the main way we actually get users to move across our games. It's not even necessarily cross promoting them. People would always ask us, are users moving across your games? We would say yes, but we had no idea how much. Now we actually do know because we're able to measure it. Again, most of those measurements are focused on Android as opposed to iOS. But you can still get a decent amount of data from the users that do opt in, and you can use that to predict across the portfolio or the other iOS users, what those percentages are. But it has become more challenging, certainly. That being said, I don't think IDFA deprecation hurt us as much as it hurt a lot of other companies.
Right. And maybe now shifting to this notion of a growth stack, and sounds like based upon services like that Chris and Tenjin have, that can be a little bit more integrated, especially as far as like data is potentially concerned, or that your analytics stack being part of the MMP potentially. But could you comment on what your current growth stack looks like? And maybe Nick, since you're kind of implementing some of this stuff as well, how would you trade that off against the kind of stack that other companies might be using when it comes to growth?
Yeah, sure. So for analytics right now, we're using Firebase and Google Analytics. Again, we're not looking to add additional costs on, so it's a free service and works relatively well. Not to mention you have to have Firebase in your game if you want to run Google Ads successfully. At least that's what they tell you. So we have that, and then on the advertising side, we use Unity Level Play that feeds our advertising revenue into Tenjin directly, and obviously Tenjin is our MMP. We use Growth Full Stack for our BI, and I think that's pretty much it. I might be missing something, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah. I think you guys use Google Looker Studio for reporting, right? So I think that's the last
Yes, correct. Looker Studio for dashboarding.
for dashboarding. That's the stuff we help you with. So we tend to work with any stack out there. Honestly, I think all of them, all the different growth stack folks are trying to adapt to the post IDFA world, and whether it's scan related or sandbox or whatever new changes are coming out. So we've seen all of them trying to find ways to integrate new capabilities like scan schema or scan modeling, specifically on the stack that Alex has talked about. So we work inside the data warehouse that Tenjin has built out, with work with others, of course, as well. All of them have started to push data out. I think they all started to recognize the importance of data and trying to find a way to integrate all the data in a way that can be useful for the advertisers. I hope that's sort of where you are leading towards. The question.
Yeah. I mean, what other type of growth stacks do you see out there, Nick? And what would be the trade-off between using this kind of stack relative to what some other companies might have?
Yeah, so I think Alex was right when he mentioned that some of the really larger sort of MMPs tend to have a different cost structure than Tenjin. I think they also focus on a different segment of the mobile games industry. I think as a result, they've also invested a lot more in sort of advanced modeling capabilities. So many of them will have some advanced fingerprinting, which may or may not go away shortly. They will also have some kind of scanned, let's call them V1 or V2 or V3 offering, which again, given that it's so much in flux, it keeps sort of shifting. But they keep putting it out there because I think it's useful for their users to have the option to use them. We typically get called in because a lot of our customers don't know what to do with the larger MMPs offerings. It's just very confusing at this point.
Chris, do you feel the same way? Do you think what you guys are offering and the other folks offering, is it very confusing? And what's the cause of the confusion?
I
And then
think that's
how are you able to provide like costs at a much lower price in kind of these like third world countries, or like India and some of these other countries?
sure. It's just built into the way we've, I guess, architected our system. But The primary way that we think about ourselves is the way of acquiring users historically is like, it's just very complex. And there's a lot of kind of bells and whistles that I think are not necessary for developers to actually do things. So we kind of focus on that segment of customer and try to provide them with tools that are easy to understand and let them compete with like the top 1% as quickly as possible. You know, building out a data warehouse is not a trivial task, for example, whereas with someone like us, you can like push a button and then it just like shows up. You can just log in and like go to it, and you know, you might not have the sophistication and the personalization of, let's say, a Zynga team that has like 20 people doing this on a daily basis, but you're at least 80%, 90% of the way there. And you have some control over customizing that as you grow as well. Especially with partners like Nick, the customization becomes much easier. And so that's kind of how we think about helping some of the smaller developers grow into medium and hopefully bigger sizes. That's sort of our view. I think in terms of how we talk about portfolio LTV as well, like one of the things that we're trying to do on, like, at the end of the day, all you really want to figure out is what is the optimal user journey through your portfolio of apps, you know, giving them like the best experience and with an association with your brand. And I think this is part of one piece of just putting all the data together and getting it together. And I think actually smaller and medium-sized developers have this unique advantage to do that because there's no intra-competition between like studios in like larger companies where might actually have two different studios competing for the same user and they're not going to want to share it as easily. So smaller developers where they have full control over their apps and they're not separated sort of by bureaucracy, they, you know, of course want to do that more and like figure out what's best for the user. And I think those experiences for users will actually be better than if they're playing like a studio game.
Right. And maybe, Alex, one question I could ask you is that there's been a lot of discussion kind of informally in the games industry about this notion of bundling versus unbundling. And most recently, we've seen Embracer, which is now splitting apart. And so there's a case for when does it make sense for game studios to have some level of M&A and acquisition, and what is like the size in terms of the company and the portfolio that makes the most sense. And Alex, it would seem like from what you guys are doing and what you guys have been, writing these case studies about, it would seem like if you have a reasonable portfolio of games, then maybe there is competitive advantage of not just having a single game and being a single game studio, but having a portfolio of games. How would you characterize the advantage of this portfolio effect? And then how many games do you think a studio should have to be able to take advantage of this kind of portfolio effect?
Sure. So I like to think of it kind of mathematically to say that, for a studio to start from scratch right now and create a successful game, you'd have to have a game that's in the top 1% of 1%, basically. What we can do is we can take a game that's in the top 5% or top 10% and make that game successful relatively, usually for where the developer is and, what our cost structure is. That could be a few $100,000 a year. That could be a couple million a year, whatever the case is. It's not going to be the game that's making 50 million a year. But we can take, because the game that's in the top 5% can't do that, right? You have to be in that top 1% of 1% to scale. So that's our strategic advantage. And the reason we can do that is because we have so many users in our ecosystem and so much ability to drive users in organically and through cross promo that they can get users basically at a much cheaper rate effectively, because most of them are free. Right. Not to mention we've built an expertise in this particular audience and a lot of these genres where we can help them optimize the games. And so that's where our strategic advantage is, which is why we also try not to venture too far away from what we're doing, because if we do, then we're just competing in the same space as everyone else. If we were to release a 4X game into our portfolio, yeah, it would be great for the users that we're able to push into it, but we may attract, 1 to 2% of users. It's not enough to really be any sort of strategic advantage. And then there you'd look at the company's UA capabilities overall as a better indicator of strategic advantage, right? So we would lose out. And what was your second question?
I think my main point was just trying to characterize just how much of an advantage you have, and then like how many, like if you were to, if that was significant advantage, then at one point do you have diminishing returns? Like how do you think about the number of games that would give you that advantage?
Sure. So there's a lot of advantages in size. You can negotiate deals with ad mediators, ad networks, Ps. Basically, the larger you are, the better deals you can negotiate. And I think you've seen these things happen. I don't know for sure, but I think Triple Dot is a great example of this. They took a game, multiple games that were not really new to the market at all, and they just negotiated the right deals, executed very, very efficiently, and now they're worth, I don't know how many billions of dollars. And so, and they did it extremely quickly too, right? So, there is value in size. Where it becomes a disadvantage, obviously, is when there is growth potential for a particular game and the studio is not well aligned enough to make that growth potential happen, right? So if there is a game in the 1% of 1%, for example, it does have the ability to scale. It has the metrics. It just needs a team around it that can kind of specialize in that one particular game. Then that's when you want to break it off, right? Because the portfolio is not adding as much value as kind of the specialization could add. Those games are hard to find. Obviously, there are other cute and cozy games out there. We're not the only ones. We're just kind of known as the publisher who does them. We also get a lot of these cute and cozy games associated with us, even when they're not. I think the question you had earlier was, when can you take advantage of this portfolio value? And I think the answer is you just need one game. You need one step of success, and then you need to kind of bridge that into the next one. Obviously, one game is not going to be as powerful as two, is not going to be as powerful as three. At a certain point, you could argue, okay, well, 25 is no different than 26, certainly. But, when you've got that base, you've got such an advantage over even the companies that have 1, 2, and 3 still. So, because there's, you don't really reach those diminishing returns until you're very far down the line. Yeah, and for us, it's just kind of been, part of it is we're not expecting to necessarily build the 1% of 1% game. It's just not in our DNA, so to speak. So we're just going to keep cranking out games that we are relatively successful, ideally making them slightly better year over year. And eventually, that equation will crack to such that we can really scale it with UA, because we will have such a strategic advantage in the space.
I think maybe we can end with one last question for me, for each of you, which is like, in terms of your respective, areas and scope. And so Chris as an MMP, and Nick as somebody who's working in, PLTV, monetization, churn, things like that, and Alex is a publisher. It'd be great to get kind of your forecast in terms of what you see as potentially big trends or upcoming things that are coming up in the future. And then just advice to our audience, who are largely game developers and studios out there, in terms of what should they be looking out for to try and be successful. And maybe we can start with you, Chris, and Nick, and then Alex, you can close us out. But what do you think, Chris? What's the future
Yeah,
of
sure.
MMP?
I think the future there is, at least for now, it's just getting all the data together so that the sophistication can be simplified into something actionable around ROI. That's, I think, what the future is. And certainly projects like this one become more valuable. And you can even see it even at like the biggest scales. Like, you think about what Facebook is, they're like, now they have like 5 apps or something like that, right? And even the way they report in their own earnings is like, they say their DAU as a function of those 5 apps. So there's this network effect there that they're encapsulating without explicitly talking about. So, they have like Instagram, Messenger, the Blue app, et cetera, WhatsApp. They're not thinking about their users they probably are thinking about it in each app, but they're thinking of it as like an ecosystem of things. And then it kind of, I think that broadens to like all of these types of developers who want to create those similar types of experiences, even at a smaller scale. So I think, and also with the notion of kind of linking it to hyper casual, they're trying to create like their own network effects, building out other types of experiences with hybrid casual, IP, subscription, all that type of thing. They're trying to create like this image around like that ecosystem as well. So I think that's generically what I see, where I see people moving toward.
Okay. Nick?
I've been in the data space for about 30 years. And what I can say in terms of trends is that, what the big companies start with and create a competitive advantage with eventually goes downstream. Eventually, everybody will get to it. And so my sort of view on the future is tools like Tenjin that, make it easy to combine all the data together. It's just going to make it so that every game developer, indie, mid-size, casual, will be able to access all the data they need. So I think it's time to be creative a little bit about what you can do with it. So big boys like Zynga and so forth, they were doing AI 8 years ago. Well, now the data is all together in one place. Even a small indie shop should be able to do that themselves. So that's what really gets us excited, because we're just in the early innings in the data play for games.
Okay. Alex?
Yep. So from a data perspective, I'd say predictive modeling is kind of the future. I think it's going to be. I mean, it already is, but we have enough data signals right now where we can extrapolate the larger portfolio where it's not we're predicting maybe 30% of the portfolio. We're not predicting 70 or 90% of the portfolio. Eventually, we're going to get 10% of the data, and we have to predict 90%. And it's due to all the data privacy laws. It's obviously due to the changes that the platforms are making. We'll see when Google, actually decides to roll out their thing. But that is going to be very interesting, because we're going to be very reliant on the data signals that we have and getting the right models in place, which is going to be kind of scary. I think one of the things about data, which has always, I guess, frightened me, is that good data is great, but bad data is by far worse than good data. If you have the wrong signals pushing you in the wrong direction, you can really get off course quickly. So we have to be very careful, because again, we're not going to have very many. So I think that's kind of where things are headed.
Great. And Alex, just I forgot to ask, so for all your cross promo management and things like that, did you guys build your own tool, or is that something that Sonamine had built for you guys? Or
we currently build our own tool. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And right now we're adjusting it manually, though we are talking to Tenjin about automating that process.
Okay. So Chris, will you guys have like a cross promo product in the future? We can...
TBD. I mean, I think this is one of those iterative things where we learn what is needed, and like how they're using it, I think is very native at the moment. So being able to understand that and help them in the right places is kind of where we're going next.
Great. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and insights. Really appreciate it, Alex. Congrats on all the success. And Chris, sounds like you guys, I should definitely reach out to you when we're ready to look at MMP.
Sure.
But yeah, Nick, thanks for your time as well. But yeah, thanks again, guys. And for our audience, we will catch you next time. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Sounds great. Thank you, guys.
Bye.